Hi, hello, I hope you're taking care of yourself. If you're new here, my name is Lexi and I read a lot of books and then I yap to you about them. That's what we do here on this channel. That's why people stick around. Happy March to all those who celebrate. Happy almost spring. Happy hopefully beginning of the end of seasonal depression for most of us. Pretty cool stuff. I'm starting to be able to take walks outside and get vitamin D without also getting frostbite in the interest of just getting into it. This last month I think was a pretty accurate portrait of me as a reader, just in terms of like levels of chaos. I don't know how to pick a lane and I feel like you're going to see that during this wrap up. In terms of stats, February was really good. I knocked out 11 books this month with an average of 146 pages per day. And that's really good for me. I really no-lifed it this month. I normally try to make a habit of shooting for like 100 pages per day. But yeah, obviously I strode right past that, at least compared to January, which was a pretty weak month. It appears I've become reliterate. I have remembered the simple joy of laying in a dark room with a book and just dissociating for hours of every day. Anyways, I am going to run you guys through everything that I read this month. We're gonna go mostly chronologically. These wrap-ups are always spoiler-free, at least by my definition, if it can be found in the back of the book, or if you consider like my general vibes and opinions on things that I describe incredibly vaguely spoilers, then we might run into a little bit of trouble. But I want you to read these books if they sound interesting to you. I want you to have the same experience that I did. I'm not gonna ruin anything for you. I'm not gonna say anything in this video that I would have seen as a spoiler and been mad about if I was you watching me and we were, yep. Anyways, but before we get into this, speaking of habit trackers, where I tracked all of those stats and just reading as a habit in general, one new habit that I've recently been trying to integrate into my routine is language learning with Lingoda, the sponsor for today's video. I took maybe 6 or 7 years of French up until the age of 18, and then I went on after that to never speak it again. I liked it. I was good at it. I had this vague idea that I would just stay good at it in perpetuity, but take it from me, it's really important if you actually want to maintain the skills and hobbies that you have in life to keep doing them even after you have to, because nowadays at the ripe age of 23, I would love to be able to actually travel to a French-speaking country and speak with actual people, but I have no confidence at all in the language. It's just all evaporated away from my brain in the 5 years since I've taken a class. So I wanted to start from basically zero again, especially after I was humbled also by the Lingoda placement test. That was embarrassing. And so far, as I'm picking it back up, my experience has been great. Lingoda is this online language learning school that offers classes in French, Spanish, German, and 2 different types of English that are all taught by native level speakers. Options are available 24/7. It's completely flexible to your schedule, and it is all super small classes, like 4 other people max. And the instructors are so nice and so committed to challenging you to actually engage with the material and to speak, which really is the only way to actually learn it. Et tu malade? Bon rétablissement. And the coolest thing that they're offering right now is the Language Sprint Challenge, where if you are able to complete either 30 lessons in 30 days or 60 lessons in 60 days, you can get either A, half of your money back for the entire thing, or alternatively, all of those class credits from the sprints are just renewed back onto your account for the future. So if you're interested not only in learning a new language, but also in broadening your horizons and opening yourself up to new cultures, you can use my code in the link in my description to check out Lingoda today. Thank you so much to Lingoda for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to it. All right, hello, welcome back. I hope you guys appreciate the immense care that it took to match my sweater that I'm wearing right now with the sweater that past me was wearing in that ad. Spot the difference, you can. It's just the earrings and my hair is better today, and also the lighting was worse. Anyways, let's get started. The first book that I read this month was Scythe by Neil Shusterman, and this is a young adult dystopian novel that's about this like post-death world where basically some people once upon a time invented an AI that was just so good, it was so cracked that it essentially solved all of humanity's problems, including death. And so now nobody dies of anything, but because of overpopulation in this world where people are still having kids, but nobody is dying, as well as presumably like other strange and ambiguous reasons, the AI determines that some people are still going to have to die in order for the world to keep functioning, and it gives that responsibility to this group of people that are called scythes. They're the only people who can kill. Again, they have quotas every year, and within that world, the plot of this book follows these 2 teenagers who are picked to become apprentices, despite the fact that neither of them really want the responsibility of being a scythe. Anything that has AI feels like hyper relevant right now. And I thought that this book was a neat take because I feel like most AI science fiction is about how robots are secretly evil and like we're dooming the world by giving them too much power. And don't get me wrong, this is book 1 out of 3. This series very well could go down that path. I would not be surprised at all. But book 1, at least, and just the world in general, is really interesting to me because the AI, it's called the Thunderhead inside of this book. The Thunderhead is seemingly benevolent and just not evil at all. It's just kind of doing its best to do what the humans wanted it to do when they invented it. And I liked that. I feel like good guy AI is kind of subversive subversive. So I look forward to seeing how that will all fall apart in future books. But right now, that's how I feel. And the world building in general in this book is just by far the best part of it. Like, you just get these random quips about how people jump off of buildings now as an adrenaline sport just for fun because they know that they can't die. Or for an example on a more serious level, all of the scythes seem to be very different. They all have unique methods of coping with the fact that they have to murder people all of the time. That is a pretty heavy psychic load, I would say, if you're not a psychopath. And reading about the different philosophies of how they kill and how they mourn the people who die after the fact, it's just really neat. That part of the book is really well built out. I ended up giving this 4 stars overall. In addition to the world, I also really liked the general plot direction. I thought that the twists were fun. I mean, in some ways, yes, it's a typical young adult dystopian arc, but it felt fresh. Like, I was genuinely shocked by the audacity of this book at points, and that is how I like to live my life with books. But with that said, the characters inside of this were definitely the weakest part. I feel like both of the protagonists were just kind of like blank slate bland and boring. There were some older sides that were definitely better. They just had more going on as characters inside of this book than the protagonists did, which is good. I feel like it kept this book afloat even when it was kind of slow. I for sure plan on continuing the series at some point this month. The first book just asked so many interesting questions, and I'm really intrigued to see how they play out in the rest of the series. It's a bop. I really enjoyed it. It reminded me of how I felt when I was like 15 during the golden age of young adult dystopia. So if you're looking for that, I think you'll probably have a good time. After that, I finally decided to pick up The Library at Mount Char, and oh, this is a banger. It is such a banger. I am honestly kind of mad that I put this off for so long. I think that this has been sitting in my bookshelf for like 1.5 years, but I don't know, you know, my broken brain works in mysterious ways. I feel like oftentimes it's the books that I'm the most excited for that I'm the most likely to put off. And then I end up in situations like this where I'm like, where have you been my entire life? Oh, right in front of me. Obviously, this was fantastic. I loved it. Let's start there. I gave it 4.5 stars, and it was really close to being a 5-star for me. It had that 5-star feeling for like 95% of the book, but there ended up being one thing that just felt like so icky and mishandled to me that I ended up having to knock it down 1/2 star. But let's start with the good, because there's a lot of good. Okay, what's it about? Maybe that's the wrong question, because I feel like the ideal way of going into this book is knowing as little as possible about what the actual plot is. So all that I will share with you, which is really not that much, is this book is about a group of librarians who were all raised inside of a library by this like seemingly all-powerful kind of sadistic magical mastermind, and they kind of see him as a father figure but also as a god at the same time. But this book takes place after he mysteriously disappears, and all of the librarians are looking for him, and they each have their own like kind of magical abilities. Like, that's not really the way to put it, but for all intents and purposes that's what it feels like. And obviously during the search for this guy, much more is going on than what I've initially described, and you start to unpack that throughout the book. It's very like mystery focused. I think that this is one of the most inventive things that I've ever read. Scoop out this man's brain. I want to see what's going on in there, because this book is just, it's so crazy that he can't be normal. And I say this as the highest praise. Like, the author of this book cannot have normal thoughts inside of his head. I feel like I spent every page of this book just marveling at how novel it felt. Just the way that the characters interact with the world, the relationships that they have with each other, the different kinds of magic that you're seeing. It is all like nutty. It's bizarre. It's really creative, and it's really fun to read. And the book is also legitimately funny, which was a surprise for me. It has this wry, sardonic kind of dark humor in the tone that I really enjoyed. It felt very self-aware whenever crazy shit was happening, which is also all of the time, because this book is like purely crazy shit happening. One myth I want to debunk is I went into this expecting it to be really hard to follow. I feel like I heard that a lot with this book, that it's just deeply confusing, and I really don't think it is. Like, yes, it's a fantasy book with a central mystery. You're missing the bigger picture on purpose, but all of the details of what you're seeing make sense together, in my opinion. If you're able to accept the fact that the story is kind of bizarre, it's a little bit nonsensical, but not in a way that is super hard to follow. And by the time it all comes together at the end, ooh, in my opinion, this book has a deeply satisfying ending. However, with all of that said, it is worth noting that this book is so violent. It consistently will go there and then go further. And if you're wary of that at all, I would really recommend checking content warnings, because I do believe that some of it is probably gratuitous. But for me, all of the violence that's happening in the story is also so bizarre and nutty and chaotic that it fit into the ridiculousness of what was going on. It didn't take me out of the story, except for one instance. The reason why I docked 1/2 star, the reason why this isn't a 5-star book for me, is because, minor vague spoiler ahead, this book has an incident of essay that I feel was handled in a way that was very like 1980s male writer vibes. Even though, to be clear, this is recently published, but the assault is used in this book as this like proof point that the victim is just such a baddie. She's such a strategic goddess. She's so resilient and cool that she is plotting at all times. And I hate that. It's a big pet peeve of mine. And there's this one line in particular in her inner monologue where she goes, assaulting her was one thing, but letting him get a look at her corner bookcase where she's plotting, that she absolutely could not allow. Like, come on. I feel like it's so easy to use sexual trauma as the tragic backstory for a femme fatale character like that without ever once interrogating it or making it into anything other than a plot device, and it's just icky. It really rubs me the wrong way in media. But with that said, that scene is maybe 2 or 3 pages max inside of this book, and ultimately it didn't poison the well for me. I still loved this book. I thought it was fantastic, but I can't give it 5 stars when it has something that just ticks me off and takes me out of it as much as that scene did. I still would definitely say that it's worth reading. Like, know yourself if what I've described would be triggering for you, or anything else in this long list of content warnings that this book surely has would be triggering for you, maybe avoid it. But if you can handle it, I still can't recommend this enough. Like, if you're looking for a bizarro urban fantasy that will just take you for a ride, this book will keep the lights on in your brain. It will inspire your neurons to fire as you're thinking about it and trying to figure things out. I loved this. It's probably still my favorite book that I read this month. It was just really disappointing to me that it was so close to being a 5-star, but then dropped the ball. But what can you do? Moving on. Next up, I read The Night Parade, and this was one of my more anticipated memoirs for this year. The idea that I had of it going in was that it was a memoir by a woman with bipolar who really struggled with popular conceptions of mental disorders as like battles to be won with the right treatment, as opposed to the actual lived reality of many people that coping with them is a non-linear process. There will be good years and there will be bad years. And this was about that, but it also was not at the same time. Let me explain. The book is broken up into 4 parts, which mirrors a really common Chinese and Japanese structure for like epic narrative poetry. And all of the chapters and all of the parts are structured around different central figures from Japanese folklore. These figures are called yokai, and they range in temperament from being like outright seen as evil to being kind of mischievous and neutral, or possibly even capable of granting boons if you treat them well enough. But in terms of the actual book, the front half, the first 2 sections, are largely about mental health and her history with bipolar, and the back half, the 3rd and the 4th sections, are largely about grief as she's dealing with her father getting cancer and then ultimately passing away. And obviously it's mixed together a bit more than that, but in terms of vibes, I think the divide is pretty clear. I ended up giving this book a 3.5 overall. I think that there are parts of it that are absolutely fantastic. I really like it as a diaspora story. Like, so much of this book is the author reconnecting with her culture and with her ancestors, in part through the research that she was doing on the yokai and integrating them into the book. And there's also one chapter in particular, let me find it. This one, I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation, but Bake Kujira. I absolutely loved this chapter. It's a story about one of the author's biggest breakdowns from when she was a teenager before her diagnosis. And it's written in this kind of fairy tale 3rd person. And let me read you this quote. "Let us look at her. She is 17. She, a distancing. She, a way to get close. I've tried to tell the story so many times, but when I use I, when the girl is me, the story sputters in my mouth, becomes too big or too small or too askew. It is wrong. I promise I am not telling this story like this to keep you away. I want to invite you in, the only ways I know how. This is what the ghosts know. To get close enough, sometimes you have to pretend you are not you." Banger. I loved that. This entire chapter I think was fantastic, and I think that her writing hit the best in chapters like this that are a little bit more artistically written, because a lot of this book overall I feel was confused with what it was trying to be. The writing is incredibly artistic and flowery throughout, which is a really dangerous line because sometimes you get quotes like the one that I just read, but sometimes it just ends up feeling overwritten, which I think was made a lot worse in this book by how hit or miss the integration of the yokai was. Sometimes I felt they fit in really, really well as metaphors or as mirrors to whatever is narratively going on, but other times her descriptions of the characters and of the stories would feel almost academic, like you're reading a Wikipedia article. And that juxtaposition of like academic info dump to arty flowing prose, it ended up just being kind of jarring to me. I also felt like the direction of the ending of this book was a little bit unsatisfying. She basically says in the chapter, she's like, I wondered how this book would end, and then I realized that I guess eventually it would just be over. Something like that, but of course written in a way that is better than what I've just said. But that is how it feels to me. Like, the book kind of just ends. And overall, it just didn't rock my world like memoirs frequently do. I don't mean to sound too critical. I think that this is definitely a valuable story. It's worth reading, especially if you really like folklore or mythology. I think that you'll find this very interesting, but it didn't knock my socks off. It was a bit too inconsistent, I think, to be a favorite for me. All right, next up I read The Paper Palace, and God, this book sucked. I gave it 2 stars. Let's start there. I thought, based on the vibes, based on the summary inside, based on what I feel is the marketing of this book, that this was going to be your typical kind of Taylor Jenkins Reid style divorced mom type contemporary fiction book. I expected the tea. I expected expected to want people to get married and or divorced. I expected to wonder what would happen to the children. I expected a tearful woman-to-woman conversation about how the main character's mother had failed her in life and it somehow led to her cheating on her husband. I did not expect the boundless depictions of trauma inside of this book for what felt like no reason at all. And that is partially my own fault, I guess, for going into this book expecting it to be your typical beach read contemporary. But I do feel kind of led astray because at no point reading anything about this book do you get the impression that this is going to be like probably 20% on-page depictions of CSA. And this isn't even a spoiler because it starts early. You're on like page 20 and they're having an argument about doing the dishes. And the main character's mom is like, you think your life sucks? Ha, try again. I had to do unspeakable things to a man when I was 9 as like a gotcha. And then it's never really revisited in a substantive way. Like you can make the argument kind of that what happens to the main character is at least consequenced in a way that feels more empathetic. But what happened to the mother feels sauced in as like an ah-ha-ha, isn't it crazy that there are multiple instances of this crazy thing inside of this book? And for what? You'll never know. And if you're new here, if you don't know this about me, I read a lot of heavy shit. Like I have no respect at all for my mental health or well-being. I really enjoy tragic books and tragic movies. Like a lot of my favorite pieces of media deal with trauma. But if you're going to do that, if you're going to go there, you need to make a point. It needs to tell me something new or make me feel something new that I wouldn't be feeling if you just deleted the scenes entirely and I read the book as it was. I need to believe when I'm reading something heavy that the emotional labor that the author is making me do is worth something. And if it is, those are frequently my favorite pieces of media. But this book just read like tragedy for the sake of tea, which is worse in my opinion even than tragedy for the sake of tragedy. I feel like the violence in this book was shock value. It was meant to be dramatic and kind of just an, ooh, isn't that crazy? Bet you didn't see that coming. Bet you didn't expect that to be the crazy event in her background. And I hated it. I feel like the entire book I was thinking, and for what? And I kept going because I assumed that surely eventually there would be an and for what. Even if it wasn't completely satisfying, at least there would be some reason to have gone through all of this. And the ending of this book had the audacity to be stupid. Like, can you believe it? And it's the kind of ending where I can just tell that when the author wrote it, she was like, yeah, this hits. This is prize-winning, big brain shit. Look at me with my symbols and my metaphors. I can tell that those were the thoughts in her head. She thought she came up with something that was so profound. And in reality, it was just ambiguous and lame. Like, I can't believe I went through this entire book only to end up with something so genuinely stupid. I also want to say that somehow I feel like I never once cared about the main character. Even though what was happening to her was clearly meant to make me sympathetic, like it's a Herculean accomplishment to do so much and make me feel so little. And I know that you're wondering, why didn't this get 1 star? Why did this still end up a 2-star book? Well, I do think that the writing was good, mostly. I liked some of the characters. I feel like there was a story here that told in a different way with different priorities could have been really hard-hitting, but it wasn't. And also I rated this a few weeks ago and I feel like I definitely dislike it more now than I did then. Take that however you will. I might have been too nice, or maybe the prose of this book have just like dripped away from my memory. No one can tell you what the answer to life's greatest mysteries are. You're just gonna have to choose what to believe yourself. But either way, probably wouldn't read it. Okay, I followed that masterpiece up with truly a gift of a book. It's The Spanish Love Deception. And this and the next 2 books I read as a part of the reading vlog that I did this month. So I'm gonna keep these pretty brief just because I don't want to be redundant with my previous opinions. If you want a full picture of my descent into hell, you can just watch that video. But this is a fake dating, enemies to lovers. There was only one bed. There's so many tropes in this book, you wouldn't even believe it. And it follows a woman named Catalina who is attending her sister's wedding in Spain, and she really, really needs a fake date for reasons, but she can't find one up until her office nemesis, Aaron, hears her complaining about it, and then he offers to go. And because she has no other options, she's kind of forced to take him up on it. So she agrees, they go. That's the book. I had heard before I started this that this was a controversial book. I'd seen the discourse. I knew that it was like a 5-star or 1-star kind of experience for most people. And I regret to inform you that at my core, I am a hater. This was a 1.5-star book for me. And this book, I mean, despite getting such a bad rating from me, it's not going to break you out in hives. It's not the worst thing that I've ever read in my life. It reads identically to a really shitty Wattpad story. Like, this is the kind of thing that I would have been caught reading discreetly under my desk when I was 13. And even then, I feel like I would have been like, this is fucking awful, but I've committed at this point. I guess I have to finish all 83 chapters because I'm in it for the ride. With all of the love and light to people who are able to find joy in this, to me, I feel like there was not a single truly redeeming quality here. There are some neutral qualities, there are some bad qualities, but truly there is no good. There's no reason to keep fighting as you're reading this. Like, the entire time I was like, let me lay down my weapons. I can't keep going like this. But of course, because I am who I am, I had to see it through. Catalina, I think, is the dumbest woman in this wrap-up, which is really saying something given her competition. And Aaron is like a 12-year-old boy who throws paper airplanes at his crush instead of talking to her, except he's also 30 and her boss. So there's that. I guess I rooted for them because, you know, everybody deserves to have someone love them, and Lord knows that these people would struggle out in the real world, but really they only got like the barest of bones level of caring from me. The writing in this book is something else. Truly, you have to see it to believe it. A book later in this wrap up is one of the best written romance novels I feel like I've read, and I want to put them in a cage fight. I want to see this book bleed. I have said this before at some point, but some romance novels in the modern day I feel are just like a bunch of cardboard cutout tropes loosely strung together with twine into full and enjoyable book that does not make. You need to have more than simply one bed and some quote-unquote enemies who aren't even really enemies to make a worthwhile story. Or you know what? Maybe you don't, because apparently this has sold like hundreds of thousands of copies. So who am I to say? I guess I don't know anything. The next book I read for that vlog was Butcher and Blackbird, and I unfortunately found this to be pretty disappointing in relation to how high my expectations were going in, but I still gave it 3 stars, which is fine by my read. I mean, there were parts of this that I really enjoyed, but there were parts of it that were not for me. This book is about these 2 serial killers, Sloane and Rowan, except they're like Dexter style serial killers. They only kill other murderers who are evil. And the 2 of them have like a silly, goofy murder meet cute and then make the decision to do this yearly murder game where Rowan's brother, who is like government adjacent, hitman adjacent, nobody knows for sure, his book is not out yet. This man finds evidence of a serial killer every year in some town in America, and he texts Rowan and Sloane the location of this potential serial killer, and they race to investigate and figure out who the serial killer is so they can kill him before the other person. It's just a little fun game that they do. It's very romantic, as I'm sure that you can imagine. I ate up that premise. This like immediately went onto my TBR as soon as I learned of its existence, because one thing about me is I love crazy shit. Basically, I was convinced it would be up my alley, and in some ways it was. Like, I respected the brazenness of the author a lot. I feel like she really went for it. But at the end of the day, a lot of the humor fell flat for me. I feel like it bridged into being cringe pretty often, and that is a dangerous line to cross when you're writing something that is this goofy. So it was tough at times. And I mean, the couple I feel had good chemistry, but their dynamic was very insta-love and like immediately sexual, except it was inside this costume of being slow burn, because you have a lot of time passing. Like, a year will go by between 2 chapters and you're told that they're texting all of the time, but this is happening off screen. So it still ends up feeling too sudden at the beginning of the book, like how quickly they end up becoming obsessed with each other. And it just didn't do it for me. Like, there wasn't enough yearning, in my opinion. Smut for me is best served with characters that I really like, that I feel like I know very well, who by the time that they're smashing, I feel really belong together. And this book was just missing something for me. I feel like I knew nothing about them as individuals, and yeah, they had good chemistry, but I didn't care enough to be able to abide with how much smut there is in the back third of this book. I feel like I was actually reading this book for the plot, and then the plot just disappeared. And that is okay. I can see why people like this for sure. I also didn't listen to the audiobook, which is the main thing that I've heard receiving praise. The man perspective chapters in this are narrated by an Irish man, because the male main character is Irish, which I imagine would help. So take that as you will. It was fine. I just wanted more. I had my expectations set too high, as they frequently are with books I get off of Book Talk. I'm moving to elsewhere because it's starting to get dark, but I'm committed to filming this today. New location, new lighting. Let's finish this video. The last book I read for that vlog was Kingdom of the Wicked, and I gave this 3 stars, which low-key may have been nice. This might be a 2.5. I don't know. It's not like actively bad. It's just not good. But in terms of plot, this is about a girl named Amelia, and Amelia is a witch, as is her sister, and their whole family runs this cute little restaurant together in Italy. Time period unknown. Nobody knows when this book takes place. It's very ambiguous. But Amelia and her sister, they have a fun life together. Okay, they just cast little spells and gossip about boys and like bless necklaces every full moon to make sure that they're not taken by physical incarnations of the 7 deadly sins, you know, just girly things, just girlhood. Didn't you have this experience? Anyways, one day Amelia goes out and she finds that her sister has been murdered. It's obviously foul play. Like, there's something very magical and mysterious going on, and Amelia becomes hell-bent on figuring it out, and she ends up investigating this mystery. So much so that she ends up crossing into dark magic to summon herself a little pet, the physical incarnation of Wrath, the 7 deadly sin, who is of course in the form of a hot shirtless man, because who else would he be? And together they end up investigating again this murder. And what I really mean by that, what I really mean by investigating, is Amelia just throws herself alone into a variety of highly dangerous situations that she has no business surviving because she is stupid, and then manages to get away with it every single time because she is also the luckiest woman alive. Some parts of this were fun. I feel like with the introduction of Wrath, I saw some legitimate potential. Like, these were 2 people who, dare I say, might have had actual reason to be enemies inside of an enemies to lovers romance, but I did not stay invested, unfortunately. I just kind of didn't like either of them, either apart or together. Wrath in particular was characterized as being this like soft boy, when he's supposed to be this big testosterone war guy who does evil things and commits unspeakable atrocities. And like, don't get me wrong, wrong, war crimes are not hot. I don't want this man to just start murdering everybody for no reason, but he's supposed to be at least a little bit evil. He's a prince of hell. That's what gives him edge. And I have gotten a lot of comments about that and about the series in general and how it kind of evolves and changes. So there being actual reasons that he's characterized in such a confusing way, it does intrigue me, but it won't make me retroactively think that book one was a slam dunk, because it's just not. The complete lack of answers that you get on essentially everything inside of this book is so unsatisfying. I feel like I disliked almost all of the characters. None of them could communicate to save their lives, or each other's lives for that matter. But I don't know, like the plot and the world were interesting enough. I feel like I was engaged throughout the book. Now, is that enough? Who's to say? I'm not 100% on continuing the series, especially because I feel like I have a lot of other series on my back burner that I would enjoy more, but that doesn't mean that the superior series are the ones that I'm actually going to read. I can't explain the decisions that my brain makes as a mood reader because I don't completely understand them myself. But either way, ultimately I feel like I'm sounding harsher on this than it probably deserves, because at the end of the day, it's just like a very typical lukewarm young adult fantasy. Being predictable and kind of mid is not a crime. I can't jail Carrie Maniscalco for that. There are no surprises to be seen inside of this book. And you know, depending on what you're looking for, that can be kind of nice. After that, free of the vlog, I ended up picking up The Death of Vivek Ochi, which pretty different in terms of vibes from the content I consumed for that video. This book is literary fiction, and it follows a family in Nigeria that is coping with the recent death of their beloved son, who had always struggled with mental health issues throughout his life in ways that confused and angered his family and the people who loved him, to the point where by the time he dies, even though all of them would say that they loved him very much, nobody in the family seems to have understood who he really was. And the book has a pretty massive cast of characters that all know Vivek in his life to varying extents and all know different things about how exactly his death came to be. And with that, the central mystery of Vivek's death is very captivating, in my opinion. I feel like I built up the ending in my head a lot because I just needed to know what was happening so much throughout the entire book, but it still ended up surprising me in a way that I thought was really good. I cried when the reveal happened, and I didn't expect to by that point, but it was really hard hitting, kind of the turn that it takes towards the end. Thematically, I think this was fantastic. It's a queer story for sure. It has a fairly large cast of characters that are dealing with fluidity in sexuality and in gender and in figuring out how to carve out lives for themselves in a society that seems like very determined to not make space for them. And it handles that very well, in my opinion. I also really enjoyed the parental dynamics in this book. There's a lot on feelings of ownership over children and like how much of your kids' lives you can actually expect to be able to control. Is it okay to feel ownership over the success of your children if you don't also feel ownership over their failures? How well can you actually know them? Even if you've seen their entire lives, how can you be certain that you really know your kid? All of those questions are interrogated in this, and in that respect, it's so good. It's a short book, it's like 250 pages, but it gives you a lot of meat to think about and discuss. But despite all of the things I really enjoyed about this, I only ended up giving it 3.5 stars, and the reason why it didn't get any higher for me is mostly because of one central relationship inside of this book. This is a spoiler for a pretty important dynamic in the story, so I'm not going to say it out loud, and if you care, you should close your eyes. I am going to flash it below me on the screen to give context to anybody who cares. It's also maybe just worth checking the trigger warnings for this book. I would say possibly 3, 2, 1. There it is. I found this to be very off-putting. It was difficult for me to get over when I was reading this book. Okay, you can open your eyes. Let me discuss more in vague terms. For me, with every book that I read, I am reading it with the intent of the author in mind and gauging its success within its genre. I don't rate romance novels with the same criteria in mind as when I'm reading a thriller or when I'm reading a literary fiction book or when I'm reading a young adult fantasy. And what I mean to say with that is literary fiction as a genre, it's character-driven, right? And you will see deviant and off-putting things inside of literary fiction because you're interrogating themes and motivations, even when they're dark, because it says something, it's making a point, it's forcing you to suck the marrow out of the proverbial bone. And sometimes that still doesn't work. Like The Paper Palace, that entire rant from 10 minutes ago, that's an example of it not being worth it, in my opinion, at all. And to a lesser extent than with The Paper Palace, I feel like what I showed on screen also fails inside of here. Because at the end of the day, thematically, this book is already quite deviant in terms of what's happening in the story. If you change the circumstances of what is going on inside of that relationship to take away the part that I don't like, but you keep the overall arc of the relationship, this book has an identical thematic punch. Nothing really changes. And as a result, it doesn't add anything other than like shock value. I feel like it really took me out of the other and much more interesting, by the way, dynamics that were going on inside of that relationship, which was a shame, especially because it was such a big part of the book. But overall, despite that, I feel the need to say that I still liked this book. I feel like it has some really important things to say about the consequences of heteronormativity across the world. I think the book has a lot of heart in how it characterizes Vivek in particular. The writing is absolutely beautiful. It's a book that respects your time and only tells tells you exactly as much as you need to know, which I always appreciate. And it's worth a lot of the hype for it that I've seen online. This is like a pretty beloved book, I think. I still liked it, even if there was a part that I didn't understand at all. Okay, moving on. The next book that I read was Bride by Ali Hazelwood, and I was so excited for this book. And you can tell because normally it takes me like months, if not years, to read new releases, even when they're by authors that I really like. I am this truly thrilling combination of lazy and driven exclusively by my in-the-moment needs and desires when I read books, so it normally takes me a little while. But I got to this within weeks, and I am so glad I did. It was a wonderful time. Ali Hazelwood books are always such a treat for me. I don't care how many like cringy millennial jokes I have to just let my eyes glaze over when I read her books. They still always hit. Her dialogue is just like the quirky fanfiction banter of my dreams. She knows how to write tension. She knows how to write an obsessed man. And I dare say she did it again, except he's also a werewolf inside of this book. Bride is about a vampire named Misery Lark. Yes, that's her name. Just let it pass, okay? And it takes place in a world where the vampires, spelled with a Y, the were, aka the werewolves, and the humans, with a capital H, they all live separately in basically little nations, but all of these countries are on like the precipice of war constantly for reasons that are never really explained. Like the politics and the world building in this book, they're not particularly strong. It will never make a massive amount of sense, and you're just gonna have to be okay with that if you're picking this up. You can't ask too many questions, you'll ruin it, okay? But anyways, to avoid war between the vampires and the were, a marriage is arranged between Misery, who happens to be the daughter of a very prominent member of the Vampire Council, and Lo, who is the were alpha. And he's also this buzz-cut, like super ripped, gigantic man who can turn into a wolf, but at the same time, he is an architect by trade before he was called back to lead his pack. He contains multitudes. And Misery also agrees to this marriage in part because she believes that Lo has had something to do with the very recent disappearance of Misery's lifelong best friend. And she wants to investigate that. She finds him very suspicious, and she also thinks that his blood smells delectable. And I wanted on record that I was told that this was Omegaverse. If you don't know what Omegaverse is, honestly, just stay pure, stay wholesome, I'm happy for you. But I feel like I saw so much content of girlies just freaking the fuck out. Like, this book is so crazy, it awakens them. It was a coming of age. And I said this in my TikTok, but it's true. Some of us weren't raised on the darkest parts of the internet, and it shows. This is tame compared to what I have seen. And maybe I'm jaded. Maybe I've seen too much of what is out there to find what happens in here crazy, but that's how I felt going in as somebody who has been on the internet for a long time. Like, I don't know exactly what I thought was going to happen, but there was 5% of me going into this that expected Lo to just like pop out a kid during the epilogue or something based on what I've seen online. Really, it's just werewolf smut. It's just nodding. There is nothing else Omegaverse going on here, which I do think, for the record, is the way to go if you're trying to take a trope that is incredibly divisive, even within the fanfiction community, into the mainstream in any capacity. It was a grand old time, but it was nothing crazy. And honestly, I think I like the book more because of it, because this girl is not an Omegaverse enjoyer. I think if it had been too heavy on the Omegaverse, I would have had to show myself out the door. But I do think it's kind of sweet how people are like just now discovering the internet. Stay gold, pony boy. Don't look up what happens next after nodding, okay? You're not ready. But back on topic, let's talk about the book. First of all, this is raunchy. And I was surprised by that because I feel like the Ali Hazelwood books that I've read are mostly just typical romance, like 1 or 2 smut scenes kind of close to the end of the book. But this one had so much tension. Like, there were so many different levels of intimacy throughout the book before they even got to smashing for the first time. And they were somehow like more intimate and more intense. I don't know, man. I was eating it up. The scene on the plane. The scene on that excursion to that random fucking werewolf woman's house. It was crazy, and it had me tee-heeing, and I love Ali Hazelwood's silly little books. Nobody can take that from me. I liked the characters in this book quite a lot. Misery is such a loser, and we need more representation of losers in romance novels. This woman is depressed and has basically no friends, and everybody hates her, and she just spends all of her time on her computer. But she's also sassy. She's loyal to like the 2 people in the world that she actually likes. You know, she has positive characteristics, and I liked her a lot. She felt real. It's nice to see somebody who's just unabashedly lame finding unconditional love. Also, she's tall as fuck. I think she's like 6 foot or something. I know, a tall woman in an Ali Hazelwood book, it's crazy. Call the police. I also really loved Lo, the werewolf man. I liked their dynamic that they had together. The endgame conflict in this book, I will say, is stupid. Like, it lost probably half a star for me just with the way that things wrapped up in maybe the last 20% or so. Lo especially just needed to figure out where he'd stashed away his brain cells. But at the end of the day, I didn't really care. I still love him. I feel like Ali sold him well enough throughout the book where he could make that colossal of a fuck up and still have me in his corner, which says something about the good experience that I had reading this book. Overall, I ended up giving this 4 stars. It's a strong 4 4-star. It's just a good time. It's silly. It's incredibly silly. Like, know thyself going into this, but as most Ali Hazelwood books miraculously end up being, this was just really up my alley. I had a great time. Major tonal shift after that once again, but around the end of the month, I finally ended up picking up On the Savage Side by Tiffany McDaniel. This has been on my priority TBR for like 6 months, which is horrific for me. Normally it's not quite that bad, but I put it off for so long because I expected it to be as emotionally devastating as Tiffany McDaniel's other book, Betty, which if you've been watching my videos, that was my favorite book that I read last year. So I was really trying to wait for the time when I felt ready to just like sit down and take it all in and really enjoy the emotional journey that I knew that the book was going to put me through. And we ended up getting there. I did it. I read the book. This is written from the perspective of a girl named Ark, and she and her sister Daffy are maybe 20, 21 or so during the story, and they're both addicted to opiates. And the two of them have this small network of other women who are also struggling with addiction that they're really close to. And the two of them are just living their lives, kind of trying to exist day to day, until suddenly these women that they know and they love start getting murdered. Ark and Daffy and a couple of their other friends find the first girl floating face down inside of this river, and one by one, as Ark and Daffy are trying to kind of get their lives together and stay safe, more of these women start to disappear. The book is inspired by and definitely attempts to honor a real life string of unsolved murders that happened in Ohio a little bit under a decade ago, and I think for the most part it does a pretty good job of that. It is really easy for society to dehumanize people, especially people who suffer from addiction, and I feel like this book does a really great job of depicting those people as still having like rich inner worlds and desires and dreams and skills, and in particular strong bonds within their communities and like loved ones that they care about. Addiction doesn't prevent anyone from having those things. It just makes it really difficult for people to act on them and to show up for the people that they love and to escape the cycle that kind of keeps them rooted where they are. And that part of the book, the demonstration of like the good and the bad of the relationships that these women have with each other, it's fantastic, and I think that it makes this a really important story. I also love the writing. I had this thought when I was reading this that reading Tiffany McDaniel's prose like makes colors feel brighter to me. In a substantive way, I feel more like a living and breathing person. They're just beautiful. Like, this woman writes like her rent is perpetually due. But actually, in this book in particular, that's a good bridge to what I didn't like about it, because stylistically it's written in a way that's very similar to Betty. But Betty has this very distinct, like magical, almost fairy tale-esque atmosphere that makes the philosophizing and like the really profound conversations between children who have no business being that profound, and just other things like that that maybe aren't realistic but are definitely beautiful. All of it works. All of it hits within the atmosphere of the book. It's like reading a fable or something. But in this book, even though I feel like the writing is trying to do a similar thing, the tone is very different. This is a much darker story, not even in terms of events. Like, obviously Betty is also extremely graphic, but in this book it feels a lot more hopeless than Betty. And as a result, when characters who dropped out of high school are like speaking in riddles and philosophizing and like quoting very specific histories of items, even when in theory these are very young people who are also very rarely sober, the writing is frequently so lofty to the point where it's unrealistic and you feel it. And I also had with this particular beef with the ending. It is just so ambiguous and like soul crushing that at the end of this book I was just kind of asking myself what it was all for. But overall I ended up giving this a 3.5, which is pretty disappointing to me considering obviously how much I loved Betty, but it's still good. This review is coming off as very critical just because of how high my expectations were. 3.5 is still a fairly good rating for me, but it was just missing like the hope and the meaning that was at the core of Betty and made the deeply gruesome parts of that book so worthwhile. I feel like this book tried to find that inside of the relationships between the women, but it never got all the way there for me. It felt kind of incomplete. Still worth the read if you like the author, if you like historical fiction just generally. You will probably still enjoy this. Just don't set your expectations as high as mine were. And finally, the last book that I read last month was Before I Let Go, another banger, thank God, reminding me what it feels like. Over the last year, I feel like I saw a lot about this book on social media, and I am happy to report that it definitely deserves the hype. This book is a second chance romance between Yasmin and Josiah, and they had gotten a divorce prior to the beginning of this book after these two back-to-back tragedies that they really struggled to shoulder as a couple. However, like 3 years or so have passed ever since this divorce, and they're still seeing each other all of the time. They have an actually positive co-parenting relationship for the sake of their kids, and they also both still co-own and run a successful restaurant together that I believe they started before they were even married. But either way, yeah, I mean, things are tense, but they're definitely amicable because their lives are so entangled together. And of course, this book ends up being about how the two of them are able to find their way back to each other despite all of the hurt that accompanies the way that their relationship ended. I fucking loved this book. I thought it was fantastic. And it's really interesting, I think, as a case study, because despite the fact that among many things, a lot of the conflicts behind their original breakup revolved around a failure to communicate, despite that, this book has the best communication that I feel like I've read in a romance novel in a really long time. Given the circumstances, it probably would have been easier for this just to devolve into miscommunication trope after miscommunication trope, but that was not the case. Like, I was really impressed about how these mature adults with children acted, for the most part, like mature adults with children. Because you don't stop having problems and hurting people as soon as you turn 40. You just probably aren't doing it like a teenager anymore. Things we never got over. What? Who said that? Anyways, instead of reading like overgrown teenagers who are just having conflicts that are stupid, Yasmin and Josiah felt like real people who are going through things that are incredibly complex and difficult to handle. And yeah, they fail to navigate that as best as they possibly can because life is really difficult when it throws you curveballs. And the hurt between them is real, it's palpable, but you really see both characters commit to growing and to interrogating the ways that they're both individually to blame for what happens. And it's just awesome. It's such a good story. The book is also very pro-therapy, which I always think is pretty cool. It has kids who are written like kids and are still sympathetic, which is a feat. I feel like it's a relatively rare occasion that a romance novel has kids that I don't in some way find annoying. For a romance novel, I would definitely say this is more serious than average. It's a pretty real look at like depression and grief and just generally what happens to somebody after disaster. Keep that in mind for sure before you pick this up, because this is not like a silly goofy time. But with that said, all of that stuff is in the background of the story. In the book itself, what is actually happening, it ends up being much more a celebration of being able to recover from things that are really hard, and the ability to look yourself in the mirror and feel proud about what you were able to overcome and the person that you became. That is what this book does, and it is so good. I also think that in addition to just really liking the story as a whole, this is some of the best writing that I've ever seen in a romance novel. It's like the perfect amount of poetic to me in this genre. And this is pretty steamy actually by my standards, but this is a great example of the type of spice in a book that I actually really like, because I loved the characters in this book despite their flaws. I loved them together, I loved them as a couple, and I wanted them to figure their shit out so they could be together. That's the recipe for me. I had a great time with this. And yeah, overall, I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. It's not quite a 5-star for me. You know, in some ways the characters were like so mature and so good at dealing with their feelings that occasionally I was like, okay, this scene is too long. We have unpacked enough for now, which is genuinely a hilarious problem to have with it. Like, it was so stable to the point where occasionally it was vaguely boring. So it didn't quite give me that 5-star feeling that I searched for, but it's fantastic. I can't recommend it enough if you're a romance reader. Honestly, even if you're not, I think that this is the kind of book that you might still enjoy. This is a newly Nova certified, actually good TikTok romance novel, and I will stake my name on that opinion. And that's it. That's the list for this month. Pretty hit or miss, as you've probably seen. I still haven't had a 5-star book this year, which is crazy to me. I hope that resolves itself soon. I feel like my 5-star books are just so like vibe oriented that it's impossible to predict when that's going to happen, but I need it. I need to know that it's still possible and I'm not just like a miser. But that is a battle for a different video. This one's a wrap. For now, thank you for watching this. If you liked it, please drop an actual like. If you like me, please also show that by subscribing. It's really cool. It's a cool thing to do. And I love you guys. I look forward to chatting you up in the comments and learning about what you read this month. Okay, on that note, I am both incredibly hungry and very tired of hearing my own voice, so I don't have anything else to say. Bye!